Mississippi State University was the site of an historic musical event, the first concert exclusively devoted to Southern ragtime music. Performing in the concert were noted ragtime pianist Richard Zimmerman and the Etcetera String Band. In part 3 of Ragged Time, some reflections on America's first indigenous musical form, and a rare collection of ragtime-era music and memorabilia at Mississippi State's Templeton Music Museum.
Of course, ragtime has grown tremendously in the past few years, but I see that its optimism is the main thing it has going for it. Of course, it's happy music, but it is happy to the point of where it's almost like shouting out loud, hooray. It has humor, it has bittersweet qualities, it has many facets to it, but it's basically positive, optimistic music. And think about this, it's the one music in which the whole family can enjoy together. And I've played ragtime all over the world. Little kids love it in kindergarten. They go crazy when you do the school assemblies. Elderly people love it. People of every age love it. There is no one group of people that don't like ragtime. And I can really, I think, safely say that ragtime appeals to more people than any other one kind of music. At this point, we're going to go down to New Orleans. Now, New Orleans, of course, everybody thinks of as where jazz came from. But, of course, long before the music called jazz was being played in New Orleans, there was ragtime down there. And one of the top ragtime composers was a gentleman named Robert Hoffman. And I recently just dug up one of his fine rags based on a floating folk strain. It's a great tune, but it has that great feeling of folk ragtime. It's called I'm Alabama Bound. Yeah. Well, Alabama Bound. Well, down in New Orleans, of course, they had many attractions, not the least of which were the ladies of the evening. And this attraction started long before Storyville started. And rumor has it that back in the 1880s on Burgundy Street, that was one of the roughest, most dangerous parts of the entire sporting district. Well, in 1911, long after those days, a man up in Hammond, Indiana, by the name of J.M. Wilcoxon, wrote a beautiful slow drag, a folk rag, entitled The Pride of the Smoky Row. And it turns out the Smoky Row was what that part of Burgundy Street was called back in the 1880s. And it was about the pride of the Smoky Row, the most popular lady of that street. And we don't know too much about it other than it seems to have been written by somebody who knew a lot about those historic times, and it is probably the most racy rag that we have. It's really red light music, and it's quite evocative. So I will leave it to you to decide what's happening here. It's quite descriptive. Children, cover your ears. This is here we go. The Pride of the Smoky Row. Any questions? Well, moving on to Mississippi. There was not a lot of actual music publishing here, but what happened here was, again, the roots of all of this music. happened very close to where we are right now. And W.C. Handy, the father of the blues up in Memphis, as I said, spent time here in Mississippi. In fact, he wrote one rag in his career, and it was, I don't know exactly what it's titled after. I don't think, quite frankly, that he was either a Bulldog or a Rebel fan. But he named this after the affectionate term used to oftentimes by the household, the servants of the household, to describe the senior lady of the house, Ole Miss. And this is a beautiful rag. Very few people know it. It's very obscure. And I'm going to play it for you. I've never played it before in public. I just recently got it. But it's wonderful, and it evokes beautifully the mood of maybe sitting in a veranda on a summer's day with a mint julep in your hand. It's one of those types of pieces. It's wonderful. And you might be interested to know that Scott Joplin made a handful of piano rolls, hand-played piano rolls in his career. All of them were his own compositions except one, and it was this rag. He recorded Ole Miss. Very faithful to the score. Well, anyway, here it is with a few ideas from Scott Joplin's arrangement. First performance of it for me. I hope you like it. The hardest thing to get is the feel of ragtime, and probably what I should say is, because people are always asking me, what is ragtime? And what does the word mean and where did it come from? Well, I can absolutely tell you with authority that nobody knows where the word ragtime came from, for sure. We could tell lots of wonderful, interesting stories, but really it's ragged time. And all it was simply taking and emphasizing what are normally the weak beats of the measure. And when you're marching, let's say to a march or something, the strong beats are when your foot goes down. Ba, ba, da, da, bam, ba, da, dum. And in ragtime, those offbeats, when your foot would be up in the air, are emphasized. And that makes you want to lift your feet and dance. Now, against that rather raggy or syncopated melody, you have in the bass of the left hand just a simple, steady march time. Now, that sounds very simple, but in Spanish music, in Mexican music, a lot of times the bass would be syncopated, like they call the habanera bass. That's not ragtime, even though it's syncopated music. But in ragtime, it's just a straight march time bass. So some of the folk rags were very simple little melodies. Many of them could be played on like the guitar or the banjo, so they needn't be complicated. But when the piano came along and people saw what the piano could do, then they realized that they could do some of the virtuoso things that were being done by classical people on the piano. And most of the top ragtime performers and composers had classical training. They were definitely not musical illiterates, and some of them just had very good piano lessons, others had actual formal music training. So many of these people really knew music, and many of them were fine musicians as far as being able to play not just ragtime, but the classics. So when they played ragtime, they could take some of the technique that they would apply to classical piano and put in their ragtime playing. And from the standpoint of just making money back then, you would make more money if you were an exciting, showy pianist. And people then had a chance to hear fine classical musicians and fine music. So if a person was in professional music and they sat down to the piano to play whatever it was, ragtime or anything, they couldn't really make very good tips or anything if they played it in a shoddy manner. So a lot of the great ragtime players developed extremely awesome technique at whatever they did. But it was not necessary to play ragtime as a demonstration of incredible technique. The problem is people did that. They would take these rags, which were exciting anyway, and they would rip through them at a mile a minute to show their virtuosity. That is what Scott Joplin and all of the rag composers meant when they said, do not play fast. They did not mean to play it slowly. These rags were not slow unless they were definitely marked slow. They meant do not get carried away and play this thing at a mile a minute.
this business of music created in our current day of conversation, where jobs were important. It created the building of pianos, the publishing of music, the fun things that you do. And besides that, the last result of all of it is to get to the beginning of all of that, you have to get back to 1895 and the beginning of ragtime. Then you see you have the first American music coming right out of the generations of the South, the blend that comes from here, and it moves on. When it got to be played too fast, Scott Joplin said, play slow. Eventually get over to the blues. It all changes to the blues, and still the same idea. And as you move up then through Dixieland, as you go up to the whole routine, you got to have the father of it all, which is ragtime. And that's where the fun begins, and that's where happy music begins. That's where you could play music, and it was the life of the party. And you could be the life of the party if you could play the music. Sort of ruled out a little bit the little girl in her pigtails playing minuet in G. It changed the whole thing. And it's changed it and changed it and changed it, and we've changed it as it's moved through the whole program, as we took the best of the black and the white world, put it together, integrated it, and didn't even know it. That's great to me, and it's fun to be here, and this is the story we have to tell.
When I was 7, there was a television show on in St. Louis where I grew up that was called Silence, Please. It was a program of silent movies. The theme song for the show was a piano roll of Maple Leaf Rag. I didn't know what this tune was, but I just loved it. And I'd watch that show as much to hear that music as to see the movies. Then a few years later, I finally found out what it was. And I started out in this field collecting records. And it was through the old records that I really got into ragtime. So I didn't have access to a player piano or anything like that. And I didn't know about sheet music collecting. so it was the sounds that I went after. The style that I'm playing developed in the 1870s or so. And Fred Van Epps and Bess Osmond, of course, were the best known players of it. In fact, one of the things that I play is Bess Osmond's arrangement of Maple Leaf Rag, and it comes off like this.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.